broadcast on PBS, and now I want all the titles so I can go back and, you know how you have a Netflix binge? Well, I can go watch these films. And her two most recent works are No Job for a Woman, about a World War II woman war journalist, and the film we just saw, Rebel. Ms. Agui Carter is also a playwright. Her play 14 Freight Trains, about first American soldier to die in Iraq, a Latino who first arrived in the U.S. as an unaccompanied undocumented minor, premiered on the Arena stage in the fall of 2014 to critical acclaim. And she also grew up as a dreamer, as an undocumented youth who graduated from Harvard. She was the winner of a Warren Rockefeller and George Peabody Gardner Fellowships, among others, and has been a visiting artist and scholar at Harvard, Tulane, and Brandeis universities. She was also a trustee and former board of NALIP, one of the most important premier National Association of Latino Media Makers. So please help me welcome her, and we'll do a little Q&A.
I actually wrote a couple of statistics. I know you didn't come here to listen to statistics, but this is very, very important. This film is about representation and the erasure of our stories. And Latinos are less than 2% of the directors in TV and film. We're less than 1% of the writers. We are 4 to 6% of the actors, and we form, of all minorities, less than 3% of the voters in the academy. Yet,
That explains it.
Yet, we are 18% of the population, and we buy 1 in 4 movie tickets in America. We are the drivers of the film industry, and yet we are not yet in the driver's seat of the film industry. If we look at demographics, every 30 seconds, 2 baby boomers turn 65 and 1 Latino turns 18. So that's gonna change. Every 30 seconds, okay? So I want you to think about that and think about what an incredible thing it is to actually see one of our stories on national PBS in prime time, on a theater screen, and how important it is for us to support both our brothers and sisters making Latino films, but all minority films, because we are really the majority, and we don't see enough of these stories. And as you can see, this is one of, imagine all of the stories that have been erased, that we don't know about, that our children could know about, heroes that our children could know. We do things besides have sexy mamas singing and clean houses and men who are criminals. Like, we do lots of other things, right? So imagine if we took over those airwaves. I like to stand and did you have any questions?
I do. Well, I have, so they charged me with doing a little of the Q&A, and I just wanted to thank you for such a complicated and layered narrative that mixes both fictional and documentary conventions to help us think about the believability, how she was posited always as a hoax, but it also makes us think about how history's written, who's included, why Latinos or Hispanics aren't included, and why women's stories aren't included. So I think it's really powerful in this way, and it raises both issues around gender and national belonging, as well as race and the complications of race in the story. So I wanted to know about the script writing process and how you decided on that layered approach.
Yeah. Well, I would say one thing. Unlike Ken Burns, who was able to do 12 hours of the white history of the American Civil War, and if you watch that, you would never know that the 54th Infantry fought for the Union, and that actually the people who actually did so much of the work, even for the Confederacy, were African American slaves. So the story that we are told is so often whitewashed, and for me, what was interesting about telling this story was not just an exciting narrative about a badass woman, which it certainly was, but it was really about the politics of national memory. George Orwell has said, who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. And what we're really talking about is the capacity to have agency in America when we're talking about including back the stories of minorities who have been so important and integral to these pivotal moments of American history. I see I haven't seen you in years. A fellow filmmaker here. And I think one of the things for me that was fascinating is to play with, as you asked this question, to play with the question of fiction and reality. Now, when we see the archival photographs, take for instance the 12-hour series of the Civil War by Ken Burns, uses a lot of straight archival, and we think archival, these photographs have captured history. It's a captured moment of reality in some way, right? Well, when you find out how those pictures were taken, he actually created his own mise en scène. He would move bodies. He would arrange his images as an artist would. He chose to frame things in and out. So we think of a photograph as this capturing of reality, but I'm not sure that we as fiction filmmakers or documentary filmmakers are any closer or farther away from the truth. The truth is found somewhere in interpretation. History itself is an art form. It is a personal, subjective understanding of any given story. You know, we often hear the story is told by the victors, and certainly that's always the case in any nation. And to me, one of the other things that was so fascinating is the fact that war is about nation building, and history is about politics. And I wanted to tackle these things through a woman's voice and a woman's story. So in terms of script writing, I took a 600-page memoir, which would have been, it had so many scenes, it would have been terribly unwieldy to try to tell, every episode of her life. So I created a narrative out of that. I took the things that felt human. I triangulated with historians who were integral to making this film in my understanding of the context and position that this woman was going through. Really, it's about a woman who is the daughter of a plantation owner who grows up in the Deep South where she never thinks to question slavery, who eventually becomes a Union spy. And that, to me, is such a fascinating story because in one sense, it's really about the growth of American consciousness when I think about this one particular person. So I wanted to explore what that was about. In terms of the script, I think I wrote 57 versions of this script, and really thinking about how to tell this narrative. I couldn't start in the beginning because she's not General Grant, President Lincoln. We don't already have an interest in her. And she's a Latina woman in what's really considered a black and white event. And so she's such a minor character in many ways that I felt like I needed to bring you into the center of the story, the shock of a woman representing herself as a man, being hit by a bomb, possibly having just died, and then take you backwards. Why is this woman entering the fray in this way? Show you the personal side of the fact that she had lost her children, she had lost her husband. To me, it's a story about someone who has a death wish and enters the first battle of the American Civil War and said, what the hell have I got to lose? I'm going to bury myself in something else, and then finds another cause. It's also a very modern story to me, so I was doing it while Iraq was happening, while we were entering into world wars, as we always do, not to spread democracy in my mind, but really for economic interests, for the, and she was saying this kind of stuff 150 years ago. So what a remarkable voice to hear. And finally, I would say there were some playful things that I did, as Latinos, making histories about our own people. We don't always have those archives to draw on that other communities, majority communities do. We haven't always been considered worthy of archiving, right? And so I decided to create my own archives. And I used, I created a family album in a sense that you saw throughout, but I played with image, but I used the conventions of Civil War photography. Nobody smiled. They had specific backgrounds. So I used those conventions, and then I play with them enough that you know these are not real photographs, but I'm juxtaposing them against actual archival photographs and commenting throughout on both the artifice and the interpretation that history is by juxtaposing those things, by juxtaposing feature scenes and documentary scenes, historians and drama, archival and fake archival. But I admit to you in the beginning, so I hope no one ever thought that any of these. There's one possibly non-authenticated photo.
Good. I have other questions, but I want to see what's on people's minds, and then I'll come back if there's no burning questions.
Somebody burning back there.
Ultimately, I mean, as I watched that and I'm engaged with this, at the end I want to know what happened to her. Did she die as a spy? Did she die? I don't know. I'm just curious what happened.
So I took one portion of her story. Her memoir deals just with the Civil War. We do know some of what happened subsequently. She spends 10 years in Texas actually writing this memoir. She marries multiple times. And one fascinating thing, when I was almost done with the film, and actually a woman who marries multiple times is a suspect woman. She's morally reprehensible.
Three
and therefore,
three husbands.
more actually. Although I don't know that she had married them all. I don't know that she married them all. And that's one thing about finding women in the records. They're called Mrs. William Smith, right? So so I had to know the husband's last names oftentimes and work with historians to actually find her through her husband's. When I was almost done, I received an email from a woman in Scotland who reached out to me and said, I'm a descendant of her last husband, William Beard, who was a famous geologist from Scotland who immigrated to America. She ends up marrying him. And this descendant actually ended up sending me a bunch of articles allowing me to find her in the early 19th century. So I think she was able to see the freeing of Cuba from Spain, because of course Spain was still Cuba was still a colony of Spain until the U.S.-Spanish War, and I found that she had a son, Waldemar Beard. So it's up to future generations to see if they can find living descendants. We don't have an obituary. We don't know exactly when she died. We don't know where she's buried. But we may, with so much interest in like Ancestry.com and so forth, people may come forward in the future. There's enough to look into. And one thing that's really fascinating is if you look for her story on the internet, and you should never do your history research on the internet, you still find things like a 1980s article by Sylvia Hoffert, a renowned historian, who wrote an article called Heroine or Hoaxer about Loreta Velazquez. And in the article she says, there's not enough in these 600 pages of memoir to really follow up on her story. And she kind of followed the thinking of Jubal Early, who was very influential in subsequent generations, just sort of said he was a Confederate general. Why not? Why wouldn't we believe him? And it wasn't until around 2000 that a lot more women entered into the Civil War history of women's roles and found out more about the women soldiers of the Civil War, of which they say there's somewhere between 400 and 1,000 of these women. And I came across these stories of Jenny Hodgers, who lived the rest of her life as a man and ended up in an old soldier's home, living out her last days, was once crossing the street and got hit by a car. She survived, but the doctor discovered her sex. She was kicked out of the old soldier's home, forced to wear skirts, and thrown into an insane asylum where she eventually died. There are these astounding stories, but very few of them have a first-person account of their experience. As a matter of fact, Loreta's book is one of only 2 accounts by a Latina in the 19th century that was published. So it is a very important voice. And many historians, even Sylvia Hoffert herself, whose article can be readily found on the internet, recants that article and says, at the time there wasn't enough research, but now I no longer stand by that article, because I asked her to be an interview on camera, and she said, I can't stand by that article anymore, so I'd rather not. So it is very fascinating how, we learn new chapters all the time.
Yeah. I want to ask folks with the questions to stand up when you have your question, because we're filming. So then we'll go with you, and then we'll go back.
Okay. In the beginning of the film begins with a male typesetter working to print the book. Jesse Aleman, a little bit later, refers to the book as a novel. The book itself refers to itself as an autobiography. Several scholars have called it, including yourself, I believe, a memoir. We don't see anything. As a Chicana, I want to embrace this woman as my champion. But as a scholar, as a beginning scholar, I am a PhD student in literature. As a scholar, I need to feel the certainty that this narrative is truly her own voice. Recent scholarship has ascertained enough evidence to believe that she existed, that she was a soldier, that she received a pension, etc. But I don't see anything yet to tie her real life to the publication of the book. How do we know? I mean, she existed, but how do we know it wasn't somebody else, as Jubal early claimed, a northerner who actually published the book? How do we know that someone is not stealing her voice and her story?
Yes, this is a question that has been asked of many minority voices who have written many memoirs over time. People always question whether this minority is slave narratives. It's a very, very common set of questions. I think you can't always know. We don't have a manuscript. We have a few handwritten letters by her. We have a request by her to Mark Twain, asking him to co-write this book with her. So it's as close as we can get. However, it's entirely possible. In the preface, it says that there is an editor who is working with her. In terms of memoir versus novel, Jesse Aleman is an English professor and a literary critic. So he analyzes it in terms of its meaning as a literary piece. Someone like Catherine Clinton, also in the film, is a historian, a specialist in Southern women's history, or Vicky Ruiz, the doyen of Chicana women's history, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the voices from different people coming in and talking about it. What I would say is, if you look at memoirs from that period, they were never really expected in that time to hew exactly to all the facts. Memoirs were much looser. They were expected to be embroidered and to make a better story to tell, to sell books, to entertain. So we have very, very different expectations of what a memoir is today and what a memoir was in the 19th century. I'm a little bit less concerned about that, and I think everyone has to just look, scholars, historians, they've looked at this question of, did she write it? Did she not write it? I'm pretty convinced that she wrote a lot of it and that she had an editor working with her. However, I am not worried about the biographical details of every point. There's enough to triangulate key moments. For example, the many, many articles when she actually gets arrested, wandering around with an injury, wearing a uniform, and having had what seemed to be war injuries. And then ending up in Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond, Virginia, a converted tobacco warehouse. And there's enough evidence that shows that she was actually there that, to me, I looked for those points and I said, well, she could have been wandering around hurt from something else, wearing a man's uniform, blah, 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 but looks like a cake, tastes like a cake. You know, what is interesting to me is why we question these things all the time, why we spend so much time questioning that any of these remarkable people could have existed, that Fanny Kemble, also an African-American woman who wrote her memoirs all the time, was considered a hoax, and that was written by a white woman, that there's so many like constant questioning of these voices. Why couldn't you have these educated women in the 19th century? When you look at Cuba and the Cuban emigres who had gone in to 19th century New Orleans, the fact that there are over 25 Spanish language newspapers published in New Orleans before the American Civil War. The fact that when I went to the archives in New Orleans and I had lists of what these newspapers were from secondary printed information that other scholars had found, and I would walk in and I would say, can I see your Spanish language newspapers? La Patria, published by Eusebio Gomez in 1841, et cetera, they would say, I don't think we have that. I don't think those people read. The history of Latinos in New Orleans is relatively unknown, even though we had hundreds and hundreds of news stories coming out after Katrina, right? So many hundreds of news stories. Few would have known that over 100,000 Hondurans also lost their homes, that there was a very old Creole community that had mixed with the French, that had been living there for generations, governors and mayors with names like Caballero and Blanco, that when you walk through the streets of New Orleans, which are now being rebuilt by Latinos, right, in these toxic mold-infested circumstances, Latinos who would work there, who would oftentimes not be paid for their work, who couldn't find housing, who lived in tents, who were rebuilding this city that was once, that's called the French Quarter, that was built by Spanish architects, paid for by Spanish philanthropy. There are these buried stories, and that to me is the more interesting question. Not that we shouldn't question always as rigorous scholars. We should always question these things, but also question why the questions. Why do you direct those questions at the authenticity of these minority voices? That is also an interesting question.
I think we'll take 2 questions because we have about, I think I'm not wearing a timepiece, I read Mike's watch.
10-2.
You have about 10 minutes. So,
Access to copies of the film?
so let's
Yes,
let other
I'll
people
tell
have
you.
questions and then
Yeah.
we'll.
You just mentioned embroidered storytelling, so perhaps you've already answered some of my question. But I was wondering, I've read some texts from that period, and some of them can be stilted and not necessarily lend themselves to dramatic storytelling. And I was wondering how much the memoir or / novel was an ally to you in developing the dramatic structure, or did you have to constantly paraphrase in order to make it fit your ultimate ends?
So we'll take the other question here and so we can have both questions and you can engage them. Or juggle them.
Oh, you're still answering that, or?
No,
Oh,
she's
do
gonna-
I have to get out.
And remember them both.
Mine's a little more complicated. Actually, there are there's lots of information in Cuba, as you probably know, with respect to women who participated in the War of Independence in Cuba. My family did in Santa Clara, where my family is from. I'm Big Dia Chinela, by the way. My family is from Santa Clara, Cuba, which is now something. It was changed, but nonetheless. And they participated in the wars. Many of the women in my family were participants in the war against Spain. And there are, written things about, writings and what have you of their exploits. And I think that perhaps with respect to Loreta and her family in Cuba, that there may be information coming now that things have sort of opened up, that you might be people might be able to get, because in Cuba, despite the repression that has existed there from many various governments and what have you, there has always been a respect for women involved in independence. Antonio Maceo's mother, Mariana. I mean, there are just a bunch of names. And there are books in New Orleans that also talk about the Cuban influence in New Orleans. But, without, like, looking into the books, I forget, right, as I'm speaking. But, there's a lot of material, and I think that I really appreciate it. I came because I wanted to see about a compatriot in historical context.
Well, thank you. I think that is right. I was speaking specifically about an American story and an American event, not about Cuban independence. So it is entirely possible that there might be birth records, that kind of material, less likely that there would be written material about Loretta's growing up in New Orleans starting at age 7 and then fighting in the American Civil War, but possible, you don't know. In terms of the question of what was the memoir like, how much interpretation in the script writing, 19th century memoir, florid, written language, 600 pages, very, very different. My script is about 48 pages. So a very, very different exercise. I did not try to translate every chapter of this 600-page. I took moments from her life, and then I wrote scenes. I would say that I quoted a good 80% actual quotes, and oftentimes played with the words, eliminating some of the more florid language and use the kind of essence of those phrases, but very, very different exercise to create something that is verbalized. I will say one thing, which is I was looking for a silent movie actress, and I found one in Romy Diaz, who's in things like Scandal and some Hollywood films, and The Bridge, the boss in The Bridge, the FBI type boss. And she stuck with me, and one of the things that I really loved about her is that she was a theater actress, and I knew that the entire film would be told in voiceover, because if I wrote dialogue, then I would not be using her voice. Mm-hmm. The actual one dialogue scene, which I chose to create, which was about her being silenced. And so that's why I wrote that dialogue, because she actually loses that argument, was taken from letters between Loretta and Jubal Early. And so I created dialogue pulling phrases that they had written to each other, and I knew that there had been a meeting between them, because Jubal Early writes about that meeting subsequent to the meeting.
I think we have time for one more question. And if no one has a burning
There's one
question,
back there.
I'll ask one after.
How can we follow your work and just learn about your other projects and whatnot?
And let me just add, I wanted to also ask about your current projects.
Okay. So my company's called Iguana Films, and I have a Facebook page, facebook.com/iguanafilm. So please like it, and you will hear, when you like it, you will hear about new projects. I've been working, immigration is very much an important issue for me, and I wrote this play that is available to be used elsewhere, and I'm hoping to expand it, which is about immigration. And I also have a new script called Secret Life of La Mariposa, which is about a young immigrant girl and her mother from Michoacan who moves to New York City and is undocumented and is facing some terrible, terrible circumstances, and she uses her imagination to escape. It's a retelling of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis with a Mexican teen code writing, insect-obsessed girl who turns into mariposas, the monarch butterfly, which is a symbol of immigration and also in danger of being extinct. So I'm playing with that. It's a finalist for the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, and I'm rewriting it and hoping that that will be in production within the next year or two. Thank you for asking. I always forget.